I recognize the member for Parkdale High Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just further to the member from Lennox-Addington, Frontenac and Lanark, I was hoping that I did address some of his concerns, but needless to say, as the member from Nickel Belt has pointed out, this will go to committee. We will hear testimony from folk at committee, and there will be a chance to go through this bill clause by clause, and some amendments are needed. But first I want to give some credit where credit is due. Again, to recognize some of the folk that are here that have worked so hard. We've got Rachel Epstein from the LGBTQ Parenting Network. We've got Joanna Radbourne, who's a lawyer, part of the Charter Challenge. We've got Kirsty Mathers-McHenry and Jennifer Mathers-McHenry, parents of Cy and Ruby, and initiators of Cy and Ruby's Act, who've been there since the beginning. And we also have a young person here, Bree Gardner from the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity, a co-op student from Ursula Franklin, and it's really her future that we're going to be addressing and changing. I want to talk about the bill, of course, G28 and everything that's in it, and I also want to address some of the concerns of those, maybe not necessarily in this chamber, but those out there in the community that might have some concerns about the contents of this bill, and for that matter, the contents of LGBTQ2S legislation generally. Because it would surprise no one to say that I do, and I'm sure some of us do, get hate mail around the issues of LGBTQ2S issues. And a lot of that hate mail is informed, and I'm a United Church minister, as you all know, is informed by misreadings, I would say, of the basis for our jurisprudence system in North America, and that is of our Judaic-Christian heritage. So I want to talk about that a little bit, because that's where the objections to this bill really come from, Mr. Speaker, what we call the text of terror. But I also want to talk about the bill itself and the amendments that I think are extremely important that have to be made to really make this the bill that it should be. That is, the bill that will truly grant parents equality and children equality. First, very quickly, the text of terror and the misreading, because I've heard these in the same-sex debate. I've heard these when we introduced Toby's Law in 2012. Again, that was a joint venture ultimately between the Attorney General and myself and others, and I thank him for that. Took a long time, but we got there. And that added gender identity and gender expression to the Ontario Human Rights Code. Also banning conversion therapy, that was 2015. That went a long way to stop psychiatrists and institutions from trying to turn straight kids or queer kids straight. And behind all of this and all of the mail that we've received, we hear the same things. First of all, Genesis. God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. You know, guess what? God made Adam and Eve in God's image, both male and female, in God's image. There you go. So don't ever quote that to me again, because God is clearly both male and female. Second of all, Sodom and Gomorrah, it's a story about hospitality. It's not a story about sexuality. If it were a story about sexuality, the author would be saying it's okay to rape a virgin daughter, but not okay to rape strangers to your town. It's clearly not that, unless you want to abide by that. It's a story about how to treat strangers. It's a story of hospitality. So don't ever talk to me about Sodom and Gomorrah. Don't talk to me about Leviticus. There are almost 700 strictures in Leviticus. Some of them tell women at a certain time of the month to go live in a hut, not eat shellfish, and yes, anti-homosexuality, or whatever we think they meant by homosexuality back then. But I don't see people, you know, outside Red Lobster, Mr. Speaker, with signs protesting. And yet, Leviticus has the same weight in Leviticus. So don't talk to me about Leviticus. And finally, if you want to talk to me about something, let's talk about the first Christian converted Acts, who, guess what, was an Ethiopian eunuch, was a person of color who was trans. Let's talk about that. Or let's talk about the fact that Jesus, you know, never said anything about homosexuality, did say something about divorce, didn't say anything about homosexuality, but did say, judge not, and did say, love your neighbor as yourself, and didn't put qualifiers around. There were no parentheses around that. So that's the Bible. There in 5 minutes. Got it. Don't talk to me about the Bible. Second of all, there's a long history. There's a long history of folk who have been working for equality, and that's really what we're talking about. And I am both proud and humbled to have been part of that history. It makes me feel very old. But going back to 1971, the very first gay demonstration in Canada was on Parliament Hill in 1971. And I was there, and I want to read you, Mr. Speaker, what the demands were, because these tie into what we're discussing today. This is 45 years ago. First of all, there is a letter, and I'll read it later if I've got time. There are a lot of people that were involved in writing this letter, a lot of organizations. Gay Alliance Toward Equality from Vancouver, Guelph University Homophile Association, Toronto Gay Action, I was part of that, University of Western Ontario Homophile Association, University of Toronto Homophile Association, it's cute homophile, don't you think? Association, Vancouver Gay Activist Alliance, Vancouver Gay Liberation Front, Gay Sisters, Waterloo, Gay Liberation Movement, York University Homophile Association. And it announces that on August 28, 1971, homosexual men and women and their supporters will rally in front of Parliament Hill in support of this brief. And it's signed by, I don't know whatever happened to him, my friend Brian Wade and myself, 1971. And we did. Actually, I didn't make it there, but I signed on to the letter. And there were about 100 people who stood in the rain on Parliament Hill at the very first gay demonstration in Canadian history. And here's the 10 demands they made. And this is 45 years ago. And by the way, a little bit of history. So in 1969, that's when Trudeau I, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, said, the government out of the bedrooms of the nations. But he was talking about privacy. He was talking about what you do in your bedroom, which really did not affect the lives of LGBTQ2S people very much, because the police don't usually kick in your bedroom door. It's what happens when you leave your house. That's where the law makes a difference. Employment, housing, etc. So the demands were this, and this was after that, right? 2 years after that. The removal of the nebulous terms gross indecency and indecent act from the criminal code. They were in the criminal code. And their replacement, and it goes on. 2, removal of gross indecency and buggery as grounds for indictment as a dangerous sexual offender. That was still in the criminal code. 3, a uniform age of consent for all female and male homosexual and heterosexual acts. So that was number 3. Number 4, the Immigration Act be amended so as to omit all references to homosexuals and homosexualism. I didn't know there was such a term. And that was the Immigration Act. So they were, you could be kept out of the country back then. 5, the right of equal employment and promotion at all government levels for homosexuals. Wasn't happening, certainly not. That in divorce cases, that homosexuality per se should not preclude the equal right of child custody. So again, LGBTQ2S parents couldn't, file for custody of their own children back then. 7, the right of homosexuals to serve in the armed forces. We all know about that battle. 8, to know if it is a policy of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to identify homosexuals within any area of government service and then question them. There was, really a witch hunt that was going on back then that continued on, Mr. Speaker, for a long time. And I'll talk about that in the case of John Damien a little later. But 9, and here's the critical one, number 9 of our demands back then, 45 years ago, was all legal rights for homosexuals which currently exist for heterosexuals. And here we are 45 years later, and we're still not quite there yet. Certainly not until we get this bill passed in the province of Ontario, and arguably in other provinces as well that don't have parent equality. And 10, and this, is really kind of full circle for me. It says all public officials and law enforcement agents to employ the full force of their office to bring about changes in the negative attitudes and de facto expressions of discrimination and prejudice against homosexuals. Wow. It was 45 years ago. No mention, of course, of queer or trans or two-spirited. But, you know, it's amazing, isn't it? We've come a long way. We have. But we're not there yet. And that shows, I suppose, how slowly the wheels of justice really turn. I mentioned that I was going to talk about John Damien. He was a man who sat as a judge with the Ontario Racing Commission, and he sued his employers who fired him because they said that because they knew he was a homosexual, he was open to blackmail. And that was in the 80s. And that shows you, even 10 years after the We Demand, how difficult it was to be an LGBTQ2S person, even in the 80s and in the 90s. We remember the bathhouse raids, 1981, how difficult it was to just exist, to just go about your life as you would. And now we stand in a world where some 80 countries have laws against being LGBTQ2S, and about 20 of them have the death penalty. And I'm sorry to say that some of those countries have been incredibly influenced by those coming from this country in the United States in terms of the way that they have written their laws. And again, without going back to the biblical 5-minute summary, a lot of those people call themselves Christian. They're not really, Mr. Speaker, but they call themselves. They use that term. So here we stand looking at the latest piece of legislation that will actually go another bit of the distance to equality. But I want to talk about my family first, because the political is personal. It always is, and it certainly is for LGBTQ2S people. It's the political and for feminists. The political is personal. I knew that when I married for the second time as a bisexual woman, and my partner is a male, but he had never had a child. My children are grown. I didn't want any more. He's 17 years younger than me. He wanted the experience of fatherhood. And my best friends, there's two of our best friends who live in Ottawa, two gay women, wanted to have children. So Gil became the donor for their two girls, born on exactly the same day, miracles of modern science, a few years apart from each other. One is now a proud teenager, she's 13, the other 10. Wonderful children, happy, healthy, and part of our family. It's great because I don't have grandchildren, so for me, they're like my grandchildren. For us, they're an extended part of our family, but there were concerns because back then, their mothers and we were concerned about how my in-laws would react to having these grandchildren. Gil's an only child, and he grew up in a Portuguese household. He's the first generation. His parents are very Roman Catholic, and again, the only child, a son. So in their house, when I met them for the first time, there were pictures of Jesus and Gil, and Jesus and Gil. And we were concerned, with good reason, we thought, about what the grandparents' reactions would be to
Recognize the member for Parkdale.
Mr. Speaker, further to the member from Front, some of his concerns, but from Nickel Belt has go to committee. We will go to committee, and there will be a chance to go through this bill clause by clause, and some amendments are needed. But first, I want to give some credit where credit is due. Again, to RecTQ Parenting Network, who's a lawyer. We've got Kirsty Mathers McKendry, parents, initiators of Sion Ruby's Act since the beginning, and we also person here, Brie Goff, student from Earth, really her future and changing. I want to talk about the bill, of course, everything that's in it. I also want to address this bill, and for that, LGBTQ2S generally. It would surprise no one, I do, and I'm sure hate mail around the 2S And a lot of that readings, I would say, is for our jurisprudence of our judicial. So I want to talk, because that's where the objections to from, Mr. Speaker, error. But and the amendments that I think that have to be make this the bill, that is the bill, parents equality and children equality. The text of Tara and the heard these in the same sex when we introduced Toby's. Again, that was a joint between the Attorney General and myself for that. And that expression to the Ontario Human Rights, also banning conversion therapy, that psychiatrists and inside to turn queer kids straight. And behind all that we've received, first of all, God made Adam and Eve, not Adam. God made God's image, both male and female. There you go. So don't be again, because I'm female. Second, a story about hospitality, about sexuality. Sexuality, they rape a virgin daughter by strangers to your town. It's unless you want to abide by that. How to treat strangers. So don't ever more. Don't talk to me 700 strictures of them tell women at a certain time not to eat anti-homosexual. I think they meant by homosexuality. See people, Red Lobster, Mr. protesting. Leviticus has this the same. Talk to me about Leviticus. If you want to talk to me about, talk about the first Christians who, guess what? Ethiopian eunuch of color who was. Let's talk about that. That Jesus, think about homosexuality. Didn't say anything about, but did say judge and did say as yourself and didn't put parentheses around that. That's the Bible. Got it. About the Bible. There's a long history for equality, and that's really, and I am both proud of that history. Makes me feel. But going back to 91st gay in Canada in 19, and I was there, Mr. Speaker. What the debate into? This is 40 years ago. First of all. And at the time, there are a lot of people, a lot of organizations. Gay Alliance Toward Equality, University, Homophile Association Action. I was part of Ontario, Homophile, Toronto, Homophile Association, Alliance, Vancouver Gay Liberators, Waterloo, Gay University, Homophile. It announces that 1971, men and women and their supporters will Parliament Hill in support, signed by, I don't know what, Brian Wade and my one. And make it there, but I signed on. And there were about 100 on Parliament Hill. Gay demonstration. Here's the 10, and this is 45 years. And by the way, a little bit of history, and that's when Trudeau, government out of the bedrooms. He was talking about what you do in your bed. Really did not of LGBTQ touch because of your bedroom door. Leave your house. Makes a difference. Employing, etc. So the demand for that, right? Of the nebulous terms, criminal code, and there was on. 2, remove and buggery as a dangerous sex. That was still a uniform female and male homosexual act. Number 3, Immigration Act be amended to homosexuals and homoism. Didn't know there was such a term. And that was the Immigration Act. You could be kept out of the motion at all government levels. Wasn't it? Is that homosexual the equal right of child? So again, LGBT, back then. To serve in the armed forces battle. It is a policy of the Royal to identify any area of questioning them. And then there was, really what was going on back then on, Mr. Speaker, and I'll talk about that later. But number 9 of our 5 years ago was rights for homosexuals exist. And here we are, years later, not quite there. Certainly not until we get this in the province of Ontario and other provinces as well. Equality. 10, and this is really kind of full public officials and law to employ the full force changes in the de facto expression and prejudice sexuals. It was 45 years ago. Mention, of course, or trans, but it's amazing, isn't it? No way. We're not there, and that shows how slowly the wheel turn. I mentioned. And he was a man judged with the Ontario Racing, sued his employers because he was open, and that was in the 80s. It shows you, even 10 years, how difficult an LGBTQ, even in the 80s, 90s, we remember the 81, how difficult to just exist about your life, and now we stand where some 80 countries against being LGBT and a penalty, and I'm sorry to say, been incredibly influenced those coming from the way that have written their law. And without going a minute, a lot of those people call themselves, Mr. Speaker, but they term. And looking at legislation, actually a bit of the distance, but I want to talk a bit because personal, it always is in Q2S, the political and for feminists, personal. I knew that when, for the second time, sexual woman, and my partner, he had never had a child, didn't want anymore. He wanted the experience of father. My best friends, who live in Ottawa, wanted to have children. Donor for their two exactly the same day. Clients. One is now 13, the wonderful children and part of our grandchildren. So for me, for us, there were concerns. Then we were concerned laws would react to these grandchildren. And he grew up in he's the first generation Roman Catholic and the only child in their house when I'm of Jesus and Gil. And with good reason, we thought grandparents' reactions discovering they have. And when Harriet, about 1 year old, said to us, you know, if we don't, we're experiencing, and so we steeled ourselves because this was pre-parent. So the mothers had to leave Harriet and Stella. They had to go through the courts. They had to make it all. My parents long since all came out to the grandparents. You know what, Mr. Speaker, quite miraculous, I think, happened. They loved their grandchildren. Who knew? Grandparents loving their grandchildren. They will ever have biological. We are one family. Happy Canadian. Nothing more Canadian, I'm proud to say. Our extended. That's what this bill is about, of heterosexual two couples who are and the rights born to them, the other baby born to. That's what the intention of this, the ideology of this bill, because it hasn't come along, arisen overnight. In fact, a long time. So let's look at the history. The Ontario Court of Appeal recognized even 3 LGBTQ2S parenting as the Children's Law Reform Act discriminate Q2S functional, but it's since the court fixed the legislation. And this isn't overnight. It's not without deliberate input. A few laws that we pass in this place, and as much thought in this bill. The Rutherford case, Rivard found the Ontario to be discriminatory, excluded non-biological mothers. Briefly to the member from Lanark and Addington, this isn't just about recognition. It is about equality, not just about parent equality. It's also about our children. Think about the scenario. Mothers, and by the way, the mothers of our children for a while until they adopted the children legally, who was not the birth. So Jody, while Caitlin, you know, Jody didn't have a guardian and parent. Catastrophic. That can be. So it's about this. It's about the safety of the baby. That the parent who is not the birth parent. Parents who are not the birth. They can actually keep the child with medical help. It's important. So it's not just about papers.